Hello, everybody. We're back. Welcome to this workshop by Blameless, where we will be discussing the importance of having a codified incident management runbook and how it can also streamline your incident management process. Joining us today are Paul Chu, Manager of Sales Engineering and Customer Success, and Nick Mason, Solutions Engineer at Blameless, who will be sharing their expertise and insights on this topic. And by the end of this session, you'll basically have a much better understanding of how to create these comprehensive runbooks and enhance your team's productivity. So yeah, let's get started. Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Cyan, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be with you here today. If you're here to see how to create a streamlined incident management runbook brought to you by Blameless, you're in the right place. So it's awesome to be here today. As Cyan mentioned, my name is Nick Mason, Solutions Engineer here at Blameless, and with me is Paul Chu, my boss, our head of Solutions Engineering and Customer Success. So we're super excited to get started today. Before we get started, just want to go ahead and set the stage with some topics of what we'll be discussing today. So, in terms of what you will get out of this workshop, we're going to start by just identifying some definitions. This is going to be our table setting, right? Going over some definitions that you're going to need to be successful and understand everything that we're talking about today. Then Paul's going to dive deep into incident response. This is going to be the core of our conversation today, taking a look at what it takes to create a successful run book. And then we'll dive back into, now that we've put this in place, how can we learn from what's working and what's not working? This is going to be your incident retrospective, which I'll be talking about with you all today. And then finally, we'll round things off from a cultural perspective. This is something that's often overlooked when it comes to establishing an incident management process. And this is something that the Blameless team feels, really strongly about. How does culture play a big aspect in your response, as well as also making those changes to this response over time? So without further ado, Paul, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Awesome. Thank you, Nick, and nice to meet everyone. Hope you enjoyed the keynote. Hopefully, there were some good talks around a variety of different topics, and we're looking here to basically tie in what you're hearing and learning about chaos engineering and other topics, and why and how it's related to incident management. So we'll get into that more. But before we get started, just to get everyone on the same page, just want to go through some terms here, just so that we all have the similar understanding of what these different concepts are. So, as everyone may know, a runbook is a term that's used very commonly, but our definition for this workshop is going to be what you see on the screen here. So, a detailed how-to guide for completing commonly repeated tasks within a team's process. And this could be anyone who you would see being brought into incidents over time. Typically, there'll be someone from engineering, from your infrastructure team, your SRE, all probably being alerted via the on-call process as well. The second note here is that runbooks are created to provide everyone on the team the knowledge and steps to quickly and accurately resolve a given issue. So there's a lot there to unpack, but I think one of the main things that we'll cover today, like Nick mentioned, was the nuances around incident management. Why certain concepts are good to know and good to implement as well. But we're obviously glad to hear and open to hearing kind of how others are doing these things, and also any questions if you have those as they pop up. So overall, just kind of go over some of the concepts and goals that we're looking to achieve with today's session. Is we certainly understand that everyone is busy with their kind of main day-to-day kind of items that they're working on. So we hope that you'll essentially glean and at least learn maybe a thing or two around incident management and retrospectives, as well as culture, from today's session. You probably have a lot of these different concepts in place. You may already have the technology to help sort of streamline, but if you are looking for validation or maybe a refresher around how runbooks are being done, in our perspective, but also from the perspective of blameless customers as well, that's really the ultimate goal that we'd want the audience to take away with. So just to kind of make this more collaborative again, just make sure that if you have any questions, feel free to throw those into the Q&A or into the questions. So we'll be on the lookout for that. Nick and I both have those screens open. So when we come to a natural stopping point, we'll go ahead and address some of those questions. So at a high level, I just want to start with kind of the structure of incidents. And then once we kind of go over these kind of high level concepts, we'll go into my portion, which will be around the incident management half of today's presentation. So, whether or not you follow a certain methodology or a certain sort of set of principles, whether they be DevOps or SRE, or maybe you've discovered something that's cutting edge or maybe a hybrid of the two. Reliability is certainly something that's on top of every organization's mind, especially as we go more into cloud, more into SaaS offerings. That's definitely going to be top of mind as we kind of provide our service to our various customers. So we here at Blameless have started kind of our SaaS product or SaaS offering journey with more of a holistic approach. So reliability will typically involve, like you mentioned earlier, the infra team, the dev team, the SRE team, but it also can impact and involve folks who are not in that sort of technical role, such as management, whether they be engineering management or kind of business management or the company management team, as well as other stakeholders that are customer facing as well. So your customer success team, your support teams, product teams, right? So reliability is certainly something that impacts the entire business, the entire organization. Your process today may look very similar or may have bits and pieces of what you're seeing in this graph here, or this graphic rather, but certainly when Blameless kind of first came to be about, this is one of the areas that we really wanted to help automate as much as we can through integrations with various tools that you may be already using today, as well as streamlining the overall process. Because at the end of the day, incident management is more about coordination of people rather than full automation or kind of solving the issue with automation. So we have certain elements in here like incident response, retrospectives, of course, but also around SLOs and service registry. So these are some of the things that we want to really be able to provide a single source or a single place for teams and folks to go to when it comes to looking at incidents and overall reliability as well. So on this next slide, we have a beautiful picture of a mountain. And of course, this is going to be an analogy. Of course, the main concept that we're looking at here is SRE, but again, depending on the methodology or set of principles you're using today, you can certainly kind of replace this with kind of what you kind of see fits to your use case. But one of the main things that you'll see here is that in order to get to the top of this proverbial mountain, there are certain checkpoints you have to reach, right? We all are drawn to kind of the higher peaks, of course, but in order to get to those peaks, we have to go ahead and look at kind of what initial or kind of destinations we have to get to first, which in our case will be incident response and retrospectives. We hear a lot that organizations, they want to start building out things like SLOs, and really it's a conversation around, from a cultural standpoint, is this something that different teams will adopt? Will they understand the expectations of those? But if you have these sort of kind of leading indicators that help with improving reliability, ultimately it's going to come down back to incident response and retrospectives. Again, I'll be focusing around more around incident response, and we'll dig deeper into retrospectives when we get into Nick's portion of the presentation.
Awesome. Yeah, Paul, I love that mountain slide because it really starts by establishing, I like to refer to as base camp, right? You want to make sure that everything is good so that you always have a place as you're climbing the mountain to come back to, and some place that you feel comfortable, some place that you can get all of your materials and all that. And that's basically what your incident management run book is, if we go with that analogy, right? So what we're going to start with is going over a couple different components that make up a good run book from our experience. The first is going to be role-based tasks and responsibilities. So what does the process of solving the problem at hand actually look like? The second is going to be your tech stack, right? These are the tools that you're using on a daily basis. Some are going to be familiar to you. Some you may not use as frequently, but nonetheless, they're going to be involved in how you solve problems. And then finally, an area that I'll be talking about a little bit more in the presentation is going to be your summary, right? How do I take all the information that we're establishing from this incident or the runbook that we're using and distill them down into learnings? So the next thing, as I mentioned, is going to be your tech stack. You'll probably be familiar with a lot of the different applications that you're seeing here on the screen. These are all different tools that Blameless supports out of the box. And these are all different systems that you'll be using as part of an incident. How am I communicating effectively with my teammates? How am I letting my customers know what's going on? How am I engaging and getting the right subject matter expert involved at the right time, opening tickets, getting on video calls, etc. What we want to do as part of your process is we want to orchestrate your incident process across these existing applications as a way of augmenting what you're already doing today. But overall, it could be overwhelming when you have all this information existing in all these different types of applications. Context switching can be very real, especially during a stressful situation. So what we want to do is we want to try to simplify that, put it under one pane of glass, and go from there. So here, another thing is, at a high level, this is what your incident management process will look like today. Obviously, everybody's going to have their own unique scenarios, what you're going to be looking at, but these things may be working for you today, but it's important to make sure that you're investing in establishing these different protocols so that as your company grows, you're able to scale with that growth. Sometimes you need to slow down before you speed up. And that's what we're basically going to be stressing here in today's workshop. Take a step back, look at the fundamentals of what a runbook actually means, and how do we learn from what's working and what's not working. Because at the end of the day, this is going to be the heart of your incident management process. The last thing that I'll leave you here before we go ahead and hop into the workshop itself is these are a couple anecdotes from customers of Blameless who have established a successful incident management program. And without reading the two quotes here on the screen, what I want to focus on is the themes of both of these quotes, right? Being less anxious, having a peace of mind about knowing that there is an orchestration in place, and then finally setting clear expectations. I'm sure a lot of us here in this conversation today have been involved where you get woken up at 1 a.m. in the morning. Maybe you have a child and the baby starts crying, and your Slack messages are getting lit up because something is on fire, right? Those stressful situations, you want to be able to take a step back and say, hey, I have a run book in place. I have a process in place. If I follow this, this is at least going to get me locked in and ready to start actually solving this problem. So keep those in mind as we talk about it, but I want to pass it over to Paul now so we can get into the details of what makes a good run book.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. So getting into the meat of things here on the incident response portion of today's presentation, these are some of the high-level concepts that we'll be going through. And then, of course, just to reiterate, if you have any questions, just feel free to jump into the chat or the Q&A. I'll be happy to answer those questions for y'all. So I just have a couple questions that I do want to pose to the group just to keep in mind the kind of context or frame in the context around the conversation today. And the first is, how successful is your incident response today process today? Probably a pretty obvious question, or something that can be kind of something that people already know the answer to, but really to dig into it a little bit more, like what are some of the challenges you face today with incident response? So keep those in mind as we kind of go through these concepts, and maybe we'll kind of hit upon one of the areas that you're looking to improve on. And then the last question here before we jump into the slides is, what expectations are you held to with your current process? And that's a little bit open-ended. The expectations could be for how incidents should be coordinated, expectations around what should be coming out of those incidents, how you're tracking those incidents from a reporting standpoint. So again, just another sort of question to keep in mind as we're kind of going through these things, just so that we're all kind of on the same page there. Awesome. So we'll start with incident severity. Um, this is one of the first things that you'll certainly want to do, especially with a remote first sort of culture that we're kind of currently in with our jobs. Communication is more important, or important more than ever. So in order to do this, we certainly want to set those ground rules at your organization around some of these different terminologies. So in this case, severity level. And you can see some examples here. We have Sev 0 to Sev 3. You might have P0 to P3. You might even have less than 4 severity levels. But this is going to be very crucial when it comes to these incidents because this sets the expectations when folks are seeing these incidents come up. Um, in terms of those expectations, we've identified two main things that this impacts when we're looking at severity definitions. And the first is resources. So, based off of the severities, who needs to be involved at what level, as kind of we understand more about the incident. The one thing that we certainly want to control as much as we can is just people sprawl, right? Just having as many people kind of collapsing onto an incident when possibly that we might not need that many resources. And I'm sure you can imagine the more people that join these incidents when they don't need to, this ultimately impacts the business and the deliverables that you may have uh, communicated out to different organizations or different groups within the business as well. So resources is definitely one of the main things that this will help set the stage for. And the other is around prioritization. If a certain severity level is deemed for an incident, this allows for folks, and by having that common understanding with these different levels, to give the individual or the group prioritization around whether this is something that we need to drop everything and jump onto, or if this is something that we could wait until the next day or whenever we're free. So that's another thing that this will help, especially communicate and establish across the organization, and that way you're ultimately controlling the resources and the time that's going into these incidents as well. Now, why do these categories matter? And that's another kind of obvious question. But the main thing here is that by establishing an agreed upon definition of what these different severities are, you're essentially simplifying the approach. By understanding these different severity levels, and as you kind of implement trainings, maybe even do chaos exercises to really help uh, kind of establish those different definitions for different individuals, this becomes a quick way of understanding and essentially categorizing for that person. Okay, this is important, or this is not, or I can kind of wait on this, and we already have enough people already involved. So that's one of the main things that this will certainly do. And then again, depending on how you approach these things, it could be a teams based approach or a services based approach. This, as you kind of break this block down into smaller pieces, will also help with those individual teams to understand, okay, this is something that we'll want to prioritize over something else. And that's going to really help kind of streamline the overall process. A few important points here is that you definitely want to revisit this as often as you can. Maybe once a year is going to be a good kind of cadence for you to go through, just to make sure that the previous 6 months the severities are working as we expect it to, or if there are some gaps or maybe some onboarding issues around what these different severities mean, or just as a reminder for different groups as well, to say, hey, we had a few Sev 1s where it felt like a lot of people jumped on. Let's go ahead and kind of revisit that. And these are probably conversations you're already having based off of potentially the retrospectives that you're doing as well. Align across all team members, make necessary adjustments. I think we just covered that. And then the last thing is involve your support and success teams or any of your customer facing teams, because they might not be as in tune as maybe the owners of this process around what these severities mean. So these sort of exercises, whether they be tabletop exercises, your chaos engineering program that you have as well, make sure to involve those folks too, because incidents are going to be impacting your users and your customers. So we want to definitely get them involved as well. All right, the next topic is going to be around different statuses. Statuses, I think everyone kind of understands the value of having these different statuses for the incident. Probably the first thing comes to mind is around communication, which we'll get into later on in the presentation. But the main thing that statuses do for incidents is that it helps break down, again, this kind of potentially scary looking chunk of an incident or time into smaller pieces. This also helps break down expectations as well in terms of what we're trying to achieve in the current stage or status as well. But ultimately, this makes it more manageable for the team overall. And we'll get into like roles and things like that as well in a couple slides here. So this is an example of how we at Blameless kind of categorize different statuses. This is probably something you may be using today already, or something that you've seen in other tools as well. But really, when it comes down to different statuses, we really want to establish like what the expectation is, and more specifically, who should be doing what at that time, right? So we'll talk about roles here in a second, and you can certainly have a very clear cut understanding of these are the things that we should be doing at this particular time for this incident as well. I had mentioned communication as well, so that again might be one of the first things that pop up when when you talk about different statuses, especially if you're leveraging like a status page too, or maybe your customer-facing team needs to provide updates to customers. This will certainly provide more visibility for not only your internal teams but also your customers. So there's cool ways that obviously we here at Blameless have thought about in terms of helping facilitate things like communication, but that's certainly one of the things that you want to provide, and ultimately providing an overall better experience for your users, for your customers, to really build that trust with the brand as well. All right. So, just to give you some context around what an example may look like, and we'll certainly show you from our perspective with our product. But in terms of what it looks like in Blameless, we have those same concepts. We have those same expectations around kind of who should be doing what during these incidents, based off of severity, based off of the situation, in which we call incident types. So in Blameless, you can actually pre-configure a lot of these things here, so that way, whenever these incidents do start, people can quickly understand kind of what they're responsible for that particular incident of that type and severity. So who needs to be involved, right? That's one of the main things that we want to help streamline and automate. And we do this by integrating with things like PagerDuty, integrating with things like Slack, and really just kind of living amongst the tool stack you already have. And that way, you're essentially kind of not really introducing anything new. You're just providing more structure as you go into these different scenarios. What roles are needing to be assigned? Again, we'll dig deeper into these different roles and why they're important. But this is certainly one of the things that'll help with expectation setting. Again, especially in a remote work sort of culture that we're in today, this is going to be even more important, right? Where it's not as easy as jumping into a meeting room where we can just kind of all coordinate with each other. We'll have to leverage things like Slack, leverage things like Zoom to really be on the same page and prevent any sort of redundancy as well. So these roles are going to be important as well. Tasks we just covered. This is just to kind of help provide visibility and context around what those responsibilities are. And then communication wise, what channels need to be notified, right? That's one of the main things that we hear from our customers that they struggle with. And typically, it's a very manual process. And if you have someone who's been at the company or is very familiar with the process, and they've done this for 2 to 3 years at that current company, they may know. But people find new opportunities all the time, right? We want to make sure that whatever the process is, the communication is going to be kind of top of mind as we're kind of progressing through this. And again, roles will certainly help that too. And then what data? So tagging is certainly going to be one of the main things that will help establish in terms of how we're recording these incidents. But that's going to certainly help with not only how you look for certain incidents that might be similar, all the way to providing high level dashboards for management, for executives, for them to go ahead and view and get some context around how we're performing. These may seem like a lot, but certainly if you think about the absence of a process like this at your organization, if you think about kind of even, and this may be kind of with a process today, it's a lot of cognitive overhead, right? It's a lot of things that people have to know and remember or reference in a Confluence page or something in order to have this process in place. But that's one of the main things that we want to help our customers do, as well as non-customers, in terms of, you know, by establishing these sort of best practices and expectations, we're ultimately reducing the amount of thinking and the cognitive overhead that folks will need to do around the process, and kind of free them up to go and focus more on the actual technical issue at hand as well. So keep an eye on the chat here. Great point, Jesse. And actually, I think Nick has a similar sort of statement there in one of our slides, so we'll get into that too.
Yep.
Incident roles. So I kind of teed this up a lot in the previous couple slides, but incident roles, I think, are going to be very important when it comes to these incidents. And you might have this sort of culture already established in your team, in your organization, but being very explicit around who is what role is going to be important in the long game. So you'll see here that we have three different kind of categories of roles here, and we'll have some examples on the right there in terms of what these different titles may be. But like I mentioned, by establishing these roles, this sets expectations, establishes the ground rules, and we actually take it off from the ICS best practice or incident command system. Just a quick side anecdote for those who aren't familiar with ICS or the history on ICS. It was actually not even a technical sort of philosophy or a methodology that is being used today. It was actually used by fire chiefs in California back in 1960 something or 1970 something to help with fighting fires. So the main thing that they want to establish is a chain of command, and that's another kind of a term that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But the main idea here is that by establishing these different roles, everyone has a clear role. Everyone has a clear set of expectations when it comes to dealing with these incidents. And the idea here is that by having these clear, defined kind of roles within the incident, you're reducing the amount of distraction and interruptions that these different roles may face without having something like this established. One of the main methodologies that they mentioned as well is that when we deal with an incident in the case of a fire, the first person or the arriving unit or officer will assume command of the incident or assume that incident command role until a higher ranking officer comes and enters the scene. So in our case, right, this will be the creator or the person who reports the incident. That's the best practice that we hear all the time from our customers is that they will assume the incident command role until maybe someone from the on-call rotation joins the incident or someone who's the SME or maybe the managing team of that service enters the incident as well. And by having some sort of established process in place, anyone could essentially jump into these incidents and report them and know that there is a sort of process in place to provide those guardrails in terms of what they should be doing. So again, if you look at the graphic here, we're showing those three different categories or three different roles that we have as a part of a high level sort of incident management process. And the top one there will be the command or the incident commander. They'll typically be the one overseeing the incident, right? They'll be the one coordinating with the technical team in terms of making sure that the time is being managed properly, or kind of providing updates as we need to, and then also coordinating with communications or the communication lead or the incident communication team. So that way they can provide those different updates out to various stakeholders who may be technical, non-technical, but ultimately not involved with the incident. Right. If you kind of imagine a scenario without these sort of established roles, you can see, and this may be kind of you today, the command or whoever is leading the incident, they're inundated with all these various requests, right? The technical team might not be sure whether or not they should explore this side use case in terms of what might be causing or contributing to the incident, while getting bombarded by management, getting bombarded by customers for updates. So really establishing these different roles, especially for your higher severity incidents, will be very helpful as you kind of go through these incidents. Again, like this is one of those things where you may already have this kind of sort of in place today, but related to the topic of the conference, right? You want to certainly practice these certain scenarios. You want to test out your systems and see kind of how they react, how they behave in certain scenarios. But then you also want to make sure that your team, the people who are supporting those different systems, are also aligned in terms of how they should be responding, who they should be contacting. So that's one of the things that you'll certainly have in there to maybe add on to your chaos engineering program as well. Okay, so let's jump into the individual roles. Incident commander, Again, just to reiterate, their main goal here is just to stay aware of the situation. You know, I'm sure many of y'all have been in situations either directly or you've seen situations where we're in an incident, customers being impacted, and we spent like 30 to 45 minutes looking into something, right? That can go longer, right? These rabbit holes can go deeper and deeper without someone who's not deep into the technical kind of analysis of the issue, but more around kind of managing the incident. So the incident commander might have the technical skills to really help with the triaging, helping with the resolving of the incident. But their main purpose, their main responsibility is just to oversee the overall incident process so that they can make adjustments as needed based off of what they're observing. They also need to make sure that the right folks are involved, right? And we have technology to help with that. We have things like PagerDuty, OpsGenie, VictorOps to provide that guidance in terms of, okay, if this is the situation or this is the service impacted, go ahead and reach out to this on-call rotation and bring them into the incident. So that's another thing that they'll need to keep an eye on, as well as just making sure that they can escalate this as needed as well. And then, like I mentioned, just keeping an eye on resources, and then just the amount of time being spent, whether they be kind of the folks or the individual kind of digging into a rabbit hole, or just overall, right? In the big picture, and I'll use Nick as an example. The incident commander should know that Nick actually just came off a pretty big incident a couple days ago. Like, would it be wise for us to have Nick involved in this incident and potentially have him get burnt out, get kind of overwhelmed with these sort of situations, um, or just maybe checking in with him because he is the only SME for this particular issue. So that's another responsibility that the commander will have from a people standpoint, just to make sure that their resources aren't getting spent up as faster than they had expected to. Incident communicator. This could be known as the communication lead. This could be known as the scribe. But this person, as we kind of saw in that graphic earlier, acts as the liaison between the commander and everyone else, right? So their responsibilities can be something as simple as sending out an email, sending out a Slack message, but it could also go all the way up to updating status page based off of status changes or findings the team has to provide visibility for your users. But the main thing is that they are a dedicated role within the incident solely focused on providing those different updates and communications. So sometimes this role can be lumped into the commander role. But in our view, in our perspective, having this separate from the commander at least is going to be very beneficial. They could be someone who's involved with kind of the technical investigation, but as long as someone knows that they are responsible for providing updates, again, that will go ahead and provide ways of getting those updates out to folks when you need them. One of the features, just to do a shout out of Blameless that we had mentioned, that I kind of highlighted earlier around communications, is a feature called Comms Flow. So there are a lot of sort of updates that you don't necessarily need a person to write every single time. So you might want to have some sort of automated updates based off of a number of different situations. So that is something that we have with our Comms Flow feature to really help automate some of those communications and updates while providing in this case, the incident communicator to also provide kind of ad hoc updates as well. So if you're interested about that, obviously we'd be very happy to kind of have that conversation, whether it's in our booth or on a separate call as well. All right, and then the rest, right? Everyone else who gets involved into these incidents, and this could be that bottom right part of the triangle there. But you'll have here the on-call team, the incident command on call, and then everyone else. So this is an example of kind of the progression of established steps in order to validate the incident, right? So if you go left to right, you may have an alert go off that then pages someone on call as kind of your first line of support or first line of your on call, and they'll be doing the triaging, right? They'll be gathering the information. They'll be kind of trying to understand maybe which service or like what the kind of smaller scope is around what the issue is. And then from there, they'll go ahead and declare an incident, right? And then from there, they'll want to, again, leverage those agreed upon definitions, as you said earlier, which will be things like what type, and that could be, again, it could be your product, it could be your service, it could be a team, and then also what severity that they deem this to be based off of their initial investigation. From there, you'll have, again, someone who will join that incident and assume that commander role. And this could be based off of an on-call rotation you may have. But this is something that once you get into that validated state, it'll be something where the IC can come in and establish those ground rules, assign out roles, making some of these decisions that could be potentially hard, and really kind of helping drive the incident to resolution. And then everyone else, they'll continue to kind of work on the incident. Again, by having these roles established, there are no distractions, especially for the people who are working on, looking through logs or trying to figure out what the issue is and actually implementing the fix. They're not distracted by communicate update requests or whether we should move this incident forward. Right, they're focused solely on their main task of getting this incident technically fixed as quickly as possible. And again, just to give you some context around how Blameless does or how a product does it, this is kind of some of the screenshots that we have in here. The main thing that we do is that we'll go ahead and keep you in Slack for most of the incidents, so that way we're not essentially breaking that kind of foundational habit of leveraging Slack or Microsoft Teams for that matter, in terms of working through this incident. But the main thing is that you have the ability to define your severity levels. You have your ability to define your incident roles based off of maybe the syntax that you leverage at your organization, and then making sure that any important details are being captured and added into a timeline. Right, that's one of the main things that will be important as we get into something like a retrospective or a RCA, and that's going to be something that you can leverage to go ahead and make sure that that information is captured and can be shared and documented overall. Communications, right? Sending out email updates, sending status page updates, sending out pages based off of certain scenarios. Those are some of the things that we also incorporate as well via our integrations. Console we had talked about too. That's another way that we can have some of these updates automated for you as the incident progresses. So that's definitely another thing we have in there. And then providing kind of the foundation or those guardrails via those runbooks. And you'll see here in that black screenshot some of the tasks based off of who's assigned which role as well. Again, like this is one of those things that people feel the pain while they're in the incident. And sometimes incidents can be so taxing that once the incident is done, you kind of move on to the next thing. But practice makes perfect, right? That's one of those things that you definitely want to prioritize as you're going through, just to make sure that folks are at least at a minimum at a certain level when it comes to working with these incidents.
Hey, Paul, one thing I wanted to kind of piggyback on was I think communication is often overlooked when it comes to managing incidents. And if you have an effective communication strategy, it does a couple different things, right? One is something that I've seen quite frequently is that, people like in leadership roles, they hop into the channel, they take the team away from solving the problem. And that kind of takes the train of thought away from, actually getting to the root of the problem itself. So if you're communicating at different, as facets of the incident change or stay the same to different channels and different stakeholders, what that allows the team to do is really focus and ultimately reduce the time to resolution. So just wanted to piggyback on that because communication is a really big aspect to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing too is that, like I mentioned, right, practice makes perfect. If you already have a chaos engineering program, involve your incident management process or your program with that as well.
Right.
If you don't, use incident management as a way, or tabletop exercises to have that as a way of gauging kind of how prepared we are for these incidents from a process standpoint. And process is key, right? If you think about, you know, insert, insert whatever you want in terms of maybe something work related or not work related. But if you're always doing things differently, there's really no way to get a baseline, right? So one of the main important things is you want to establish a consistent process. So that way it may be tough and a little frictionsome to adopt in the beginning, but by following the same process every single time, it's easier to find kind of the deviations, right? Like what went well, what didn't go well.
If you're always doing things ad hoc, it's really hard to kind of nail that down. So that's another benefit of having that established process across the board. Before I hand it over to Nick, this is my last slide, and actually will kind of bring up like two questions that I hear a lot or think about a lot when I work with customers is what makes running or following a runbook difficult, and what can you do to make this easier? I think at the end of the day, it's accountability. Having a team or an individual own this process is going to be your best bet for seeing success around incident management. Typically, it could be a group effort for a lot of organizations, but by having a dedicated team or a dedicated individual that oversees the incident management program, similar to how you may or may not be doing for chaos engineering, is going to be key to this success. And then with that, the question I'm posing to the audience is: do you actually have a owner for your incident response process? From what we're seeing, large organizations will definitely have an owner because they have the resources and the time to have someone oversee that program. For smaller organizations, you may see kind of more of a group ownership. But again, from our experience, and actually one of our customers that we highlighted, the reason for their success is because they have someone driving this, not only for incident management, but also for retrospectives, which is going to be the next topic that we'll go through. So again, this is the last slide for my half of the presentation, but feel free to shoot any questions in the chat. I'm happy to look into it. Oh, I did see John's question here. I'm not sure if it was answered, but how has Blameless Incident Management integrated with the existing chaos engineering tools out there? We don't have a direct integration or an out of the box integration with some of the chaos engineering tools out there, but indirectly we do, right? So we do integrate with PagerDuty as an example. So if your chaos engineering exercises will trigger a PagerDuty alert, that can automatically trigger a blameless incident. So happy to kind of dig into that more, but let me know if you have any questions. Awesome. Take it away.
Yep. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, one thing I wanted to just quickly highlight on that last slide that Paul shared was having an ownership of the program. I think that's a really good baseline for starting to talk about retrospectives because, in a way, everybody has their seat at the table when it comes to incident management. And having a retrospective and the second part that I'll be talking about, a blameless culture, is a great way of making sure that everybody is heard when it comes to what's working, what's not working in the process that you've built out, the run books that you've put out. So that's what we'll be talking about here. We'll focus on the retrospective and this idea of a blameless culture. If you don't know what a blameless culture is, don't worry. We'll go deep into that because I do think that that is something that is very pivotal when it comes to getting this right. So let's go ahead and kick things off. We'll start with two quotes, both from customers of ours. And as you're reading these on your screen, I want you to think of a couple different questions here. So why do retrospectives? And then the second one is, how do you successfully make these a part of your process? What I've seen personally is that retrospectives are often overlooked when it comes to incident management as a whole. I've even heard some prospects turned customers that came to Blameless where they say, the team spends so much time troubleshooting, solving the problem. There's so much headache that documenting and meeting after the fact is just a chore rather than a benefit. Engineering teams sometimes look at this like documenting code, right? No one likes to do it, but it's an important aspect about maintaining a clean software environment. But based off my experience and the reason why we're talking about this today is that if you do a blameless retrospective in the right way, this is a really powerful vehicle to help you drive process improvements and cultural change to your organization. So the two quotes that you see here on the screen, I'm going to read these two because they're quite short. The first one just says, using a tool like Blameless allows me to build a case with hard data to say I need to fix this. And the second one says, this is a way to focus on getting to the true cause of something. Keep those in mind because as we get into our next slide here, we're going to talk about why do a retrospective and what we need to learn and actually document in order to do these appropriately. And coming back to those quotes, the operative words there is building a case with hard data and getting to the true cause of something. This is exactly why retrospectives are so powerful. So let's break it down. How do we get started, right? Some people out there may be doing retros today. Some may kind of be doing it in an ad hoc basis. Some may not even be doing it at all. So let's take a step back and look at, what information do we actually need to be providing as part of this post-incident review? First and foremost is your technical evaluation, right? This is always going to be something that's going to be part of your retrospective process. There was a question earlier, what services are impacted, which products were impacted, which one of my customers were impacted. At the end of the day, what were the technical initiatives that we put into place as follow-up actions so that we can make sure we come back to those so that this problem doesn't happen again. We want to try to avoid repeat incidents, and gathering information like this allows us to, one, document this, but then two, bubble those up into reports so that we can learn from them. The second aspect about a retrospective, and one that's often overlooked, is the cultural side of the house. And this is a big area that Blameless advocates for, is how is your process or your run book that we've talked about today actually working for the team, right? I've had so many people come to us and say, hey, either it's a homegrown solution or something that they put into place where they say, we put this into place a year ago and we've been using it and there are things that are not working. We haven't changed anything. Something that I'll often say, incident management is an iterative motion, right? Things are always going to be changing. And the cultural aspect of a retrospective is how you drive that change. So we want to make sure that we're answering questions like, how are we communicating, right? Are we effectively communicating to the right stakeholders? If not, who's not getting notified so that we can automate that in the future and avoid that communication issue, as I talked about earlier? Asking questions like, are the right individuals or groups automatically added to my incident channel when they're created? How did I feel about coming into this incident? Did I have the right resources? Was my run book up to date? Were the right steps there? If not, what did you have to do so that we can go back and document those steps so that when the next person encounters an issue like this, they're more well equipped to actually battle this problem. The last thing I want to leave everybody with on this slide here is that this is not going to be perfect on day one, right? And having a really strong retrospective process allows you to, first and foremost, recognize that and create a culture where people feel comfortable actually coming in and giving these recommendations so that you can grow as a team. So now that we've discussed the benefits of using retrospectives, let's talk about how we actually get started. Let's discuss some of the high-level best practices to get started, starting with who should be organizing and taking ownership of completing the retrospective, right? There was another question that came in the chat, what does the commander actually do? Where are they limited to? Again, this is going to be different for every organization, but one thing that we advocate for, and something that Paul mentioned earlier, the incident commander is there orchestrating the incident from start to finish. Ultimately, they're the ones that's helping drive this incident towards resolution. So best practice that we've seen is usually the incident commander is the one who's responsible for completing the retrospective, if not making sure that it is getting in the right person's hand to go and complete this. However, another point of view is, maybe you have an engineering lead or a subject matter expert who basically helps solve the problem at hand. That would be a great person to complete the retro because they're going to be the ones that knows what are the technical steps that actually helped us solve this problem. The next thing that I want to highlight here is what type of retrospective are we actually encountering? The Blameless team always recommends completing a retrospective anytime you have an incident because, as I mentioned before, it's a vehicle of learning and cultural change, just like Jesse mentioned in the chat, right? And what I mean by different types of retrospective is depending on the severity, like Paul mentioned earlier, maybe you feel like you don't need to go in and complete a retro because maybe it was a low severity incident. Maybe it turned out to actually not be an incident. But what I advocate for is, even on those low severity incidents, it's always good to document your findings. And something that I've seen work quite well is you can modify the types of questions or the types of information that you need to capture in your retrospective depending on that priority. Hopefully, if it is a lower severity, you can take that information, learn from it, distribute it to the team, and then if something, heaven forbid, comes up like that again, you'll at least know that, hey, based on these, key factors that we captured in the retro, we don't need to go and create an incident. You can templatize different retrospective templates based off of incident types as well, as Paul mentioned earlier, the types of problem that you're encountering. And these are all different aspects that are encompassed in the Blameless platform. So just keep that one in mind. And then finally, I want to touch on, use priority as a way to know how much time you actually need to get this retrospective done. As I mentioned before, sometimes you get woken up 1 a.m. in the morning. It's all hands on deck. It's a stressful situation. You solve the problem, hooray, right? You don't want to immediately jump into a document, but the priority in which the incident was labeled can help you identify how fast do we actually need to get this write-up out. Are there customers that are expecting to get a copy of this? Or is this something that we can take a step back, maybe grab a cup of coffee, huddle up with the team in a day or two and make sure that we're documenting our findings. The moral of the story here is to utilize all the resources that you have in place during your configuration in order to help you know what you need to get into your retrospective and how fast you actually need to get this done. I want to take your attention to the quote from one of our customers over here on the side, because this is going to set us up quite nicely for the next half of my presentation here. So Blameless has helped us simplify the process. It has changed our culture and encourages involvement and collaboration around failures. So the key words in this quote, again, is culture, and that's going to be the next area that we're going to be spending our time on. Encourages involvement and collaboration around failures. So
Yeah, one quick thing I just want to add in there is that
Yeah.
obviously like retros are going to be pretty painful, especially if you're not doing them today. Outside of maybe an executive asking for it because it was a big incident, right? So any new process, as we all know, is going to take some time for it to really get going and kind of having everyone on board. But like we said earlier, and like Jesse said in the chat as well, it's every opportunity is every incident is a learning opportunity, and you learn more about these incidents. And just to get and another perspective to take into mind too is that just because you have more incidents, it's not all bad, right? If you look at the flip side, by having these more of these incidents, you're learning more about your systems and how they behave, what to look out for, how we need to adjust things. So just look at it as a way of it's an unplanned opportunity to learn, and having these retrospectives will really help capture a lot of those findings and essentially be shareable with other folks too. So
Yep.
just want to throw that in there.
Oh, that's great, Paul. Paul and I were talking the other day, and doing and getting into retrospectives is almost like going to the gym, right? It hurts a lot when you get there for the first day. Maybe you haven't worked out in quite some time, and as you continue to do them, the process gets a lot easier. It becomes a lot less painful, and then you really start to see the results. So I just thought I'd throw that one out there because that one really resonates with me. Is once you start doing the process consistently, it's going to really start to pay off for you. And at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about here. Is what we're trying to do is we're trying to drive towards this cultural change, and the retrospective is that vehicle of doing that. So what you're seeing here on the screen, it's the concept of what is blamelessness. So we talked about what is a blameless culture, and I think understanding that blamelessness is not about avoiding blame, it's about being empty of it, is a very important key area to touch on before we get into that cultural aspect that we've talked so much about. The way that you set up your incident management process and retrospective reviews needs to be in a way where the team feels heard and not being put at fault. And every incident is an opportunity to learn, like we've mentioned so many times. Having this blameless environment to get feedback on what's working and what's not working will favor you over time. And the more you establish this cultural identity, the team will feel more comfortable actually submitting your feedback, right? And a couple different things to note here is that, why does blame exist within an organization? We're all guilty of it, right? We're drawn to simple explanations for over complex systems. We're got a ton of work on our plate, especially with the way everything has been going the past couple of years, where we've been asked to do a lot more. Blame totally exists, but how can we actually avoid this blame? Communication is one, making sure that people feel comfortable communicating, and then also documenting through your retrospectives. And this leads us to the next slide, and something that I feel very strongly about is trust the process that we've talked about today. If you don't trust the process and you don't follow those steps in your run book, you won't learn what's working and what's not working. What are the gaps? So this is definitely an area where, if you have that safe environment, if you know that you're not going to be blamed, and you know that you feel comfortable asking those questions and giving your feedback, it's going to really allow that process to iterate and work better for the team as you continue to grow. The last thing on this slide here is that struggling is okay. As I mentioned beforehand, we all go through this, right? Whether it's in our chaos engineering exercises or if it's related to incident management, nothing's ever going to be perfect. We identify a starting point, we iterate, we see what's working, what's not working, and we continue to grow. The last points that I want to make here on the next slide is a couple different areas we've already talked about, but what makes a good retrospective? I think there's a couple key areas that as you go back and evaluate your process internally, that you can take back and potentially add to your process. And this is something that Blameless offers too through our retrospective process. But the first thing here about what makes a good retrospective is your executive summary. I think about this like reading the back of a book, right? I should be able to pick this up, read a short paragraph, and understand what happened, who was involved, etc. The next thing is going to be your technical details. This is where your commander, your engineering lead are going to be, pivotal roles in establishing these, right? Teams involved, mitigation steps, related tags, products impacted, services impacted, your timing metrics, right? And then finally, your cultural aspects, like I've said so many times already. Coming in, like if you're using Slack, for example, were the right channels automatically notified when a problem was occurring or when the severity was escalated? Were the right people automatically involved, or were the right, services in your alerting systems automatically paged when something is happening? Was the blast radius too big? That's another thing culturally, right? We don't want to go in and set everybody's hair on fire. You want to know, hey, what's the right amount of communication? And the retrospective is a great way of identifying these over time. Taking all this information, utilizing the answers to these questions is something that's going to help you improve. And ultimately, it's going to help you drive towards a blameless culture. So last slide that I have here is going to be, in efforts to learn from every incident, as I've said, being comfortable with gathering this information, whether it be you're running incidents through Slack or Microsoft Teams. If you don't have that blameless mindset, something that you may think is the answer could very well be the answer to solving your problem, right? So if you have a good mindset and you feel comfortable with giving your opinions on, what could be the problem, that very well may help you in solving your problem quicker, faster, stronger. And ultimately, what it allows you to do is learn from it, right? The worst thing that can happen is maybe it's not the problem. It's not the solution to the problem. But again, you're able to learn from that so that if you encounter something like this in the future, you can go back in and say, "Hope, we tried that. Let's learn from it. Let's go with a different approach." Learning from the problem is just as important as solving the problem. That's something that you'll hear me talk about over and over and over again. And I hope that, the steps that we've talked about in how to establish this cultural aspect as well as running these retrospectives will help you and your team iterate on your runbook definitions and your incident management program overall. So just as a recap, what we've learned today, we've identified why a codified incident management runbook actually matters, some of the tips and tricks, some of your best practices to actually come in and make sure that these are working for your team. How do you gain information from what's working, what's not working, and bubble those up into retrospectives? understanding how culture plays a big part about that. And then finally, the intersection between runbooks, tooling, and integrations. So that's it for us today. I want to thank everybody for coming. One last slide that we have here, Paul. If you enjoyed the presentation today and you want to see what Blameless has to offer, pull out your phone, take a snapshot of the QR code here. What this is going to do is it's going to take you to our website where you can get started with a free trial of the tool. If you enjoyed hearing us speak today too, Paul and I are the front of the line when it comes to trials with Blameless. So if you wanted to even just talk with us a little bit more, this is a great way of engaging with us and getting your hands dirty with some of the tips and tricks that we shared today. So thank you so much. I appreciate everybody coming, and we look forward to chatting soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone. We'll stay on too for a little bit to answer any kind of questions. I see one that I'll respond to here in a second. Um, and the last thing I'll mention is, it may seem like a big sort of project to take on for yourself individually or for your team. But at the very least, just start the conversation, right?
Right.
Especially in the wake of an incident, um, have that conversation, and really be that person who's gonna garner interest, garner excitement around why we should be doing these things, or like what learnings you found and why retrospectives are important. And again, like Nick was mentioning, we're on the front lines. We talk to folks all the time. So if you want to kind of just chat about what we're seeing in the space and the industry, we're also happy to share some of those best practices as well. So again, thank you everyone. We have we'll answer some questions here as well, but looking forward to speaking with some of y'all.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Paul and Nick. It was a great talk. So much learning, so much things to document and go through step by step. So yeah, I also see a couple of questions. I had
Yep.
one myself. I was a little curious on, like, it's a lot to take in, honestly, because you have like a very streamlined process, and it's of course a kind of like the best practices you should be doing when you are monitoring incidents. So like I wanted to know if like uh, what are kind of like the pitfalls, or what are the common things you generally want to avoid when you are creating or managing a runbook.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think one thing that I would highly advocate for is start small, right? Because I've seen some people who have come to us where they have like a very built out process and the team feels like it's almost overwhelming when you
Mm.
come into an incident. There's
Yeah.
already a problem at hand. You want to come into an area where you feel guided, not even more overwhelmed. So start small. Use the retrospective as a way of saying, if I had 5 tasks in my investigating stage and you feel like there's something that was missing, use
Yeah.
the retrospective as a way of saying, hey, based off of my findings, the run book worked for me, steps 1 through 5, but then there was actually a 6th and 7th step. Maybe someone else was experiencing the exact same thing. And as you're going through those analytics about what's working, what's not working, you could then iterate on those run books and add those as steps if necessary. So that's one thing. Start small and take it one step at a time.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. Makes sense. So the other question is by Angel. How do you set and enforce expectations around the quality of these retrospectives?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just typed my response in there, so I'll take that for now. And then, yeah, Nick, if you have anything, I think the main thing is just having a meeting, right? If you have like a meeting every week, every 2 weeks to dedicate uh, reviewing the retrospectives from maybe the previous week or two, I think that becomes a forcing function for folks to really put their best effort and complete these retrospectives as well. I think from a cultural standpoint, that's probably something that we see as very successful. From more of a tactical standpoint, just providing the templates, right? And you probably have some sort of template. If not, we're happy to share with you some templates that we see. And then you might have missed this in the presentation, but Nick had mentioned earlier you might have different templates or different retrospectives based off of the severity or the incident type or scenario.
So there are ways to also have maybe a shortened sort of like form of questions that acts as your retrospective while still capturing the feedback from the folks who are involved. So just to recap, set up a meeting just to dedicate to reviewing retrospectives and then providing resources like templates for folks to then follow.
One other kind of plug I'll add in there too is that in the retrospective that Blameless offers, we have something called custom questions. And what that allows you to do is, maybe this is something that you're just starting. And something that I often see is that someone will go and fill out the retrospective. They'll then escalate it up to their manager for approval. They'll come back and they'll say, hey, you didn't answer these questions correctly, or there's more information that is needed. So what the custom questions in the retrospective that Blameless offers allows you to do is whoever's kind of establishing that process say, hey, these are the 10 most important questions that we need to answer in order for this thing to be publishable. And within that, you can go in and make them required. You can make them conditionally required, how you gather the information. The benefit of doing it in a tool like Blameless is that it becomes reportable. Right? A lot of people do these retros in collaborative text editors like Google Docs, Confluence, Notion. The problem there is, those are great tools. I'm not going to, harp on that. But the problem there is that you have to go and actually read the document, right? And that takes away time and energy from the team that's already tired from solving the problem. So that's one area that we could potentially help with.
Yeah, got it. Makes sense. Cool. If there are any other questions, feel free to drop them. Nick, Paul, do you want to touch upon any of the previous ones and just talk about them, or are we good?
Let's see. Angel, thank you so much for coming. I think we got everything.
Yeah. Okay then. Awesome.
Paul, any final words?
Stay strong. It's not an easy problem to solve, but again, we're here to help kind of drive that conversation as well. Whether it's a product standpoint or not, we're always here to help out. So
100%. Thank you so
Awesome.
much for your time, everyone. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. So if you folks still have some questions, we have a Slack channel for CC23 Blameless. You can go there and ask all your questions. I'm sure they'll help you out. Okay. Awesome. Thank you guys for joining in. Thank you guys for this amazing presentation. We'll see you guys soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
thank you.